In Sag Harbor, I'm David Alpern. As Penny was starting to say, for more than 40 years, a Newsweek magazine reporter, writer, editor, and network radio host. I'm glad to see you all out there in Zoom Hampton for what the Rogers Memorial Library calls coffee and conversation about issues in the news. And certainly in the news is today's topic, how to handle China, from mass arrests after its undermining of democracy in Hong Kong, the border clashes with India, to the persistent scourge of the coronavirus it exported worldwide, most fatal here in the United States. Winston Churchill in 1939 famously bemoaned the difficulty in dealing with a Russia he saw as, quote, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But he said, perhaps there is a key. The key is Russian national interest. Russia is a little easier to understand, though not necessarily to deal with these days under Vladimir Putin. But Churchill's oft-quoted description and prescription might well be applied to the greater challenge now presented by China. It is both the source of the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, but also of medical resources needed to deal with that deadly health threat and others. It is, if not an outright enemy, at least increasingly a competitor in matters of economics, diplomacy, military might, and as a model for most effective governance. And it is both castigated and cozied up to, pleaded with in John Bolton's account by the current US administration. The question is, how do we best compete in line with American principles and interests without starting another Cold War or a hot one? To help us consider these and related issues, our guest expert today is Tom Grunfeld, State University of New York Distinguished Teaching Professor Emeritus. He specializes in the modern history of East Asia, particularly of China and of Tibet, about which he gave a webinar for the library several weeks ago. And he's agreed to start us off with some necessary context for our conversation. So Tom, take it away.
Thank you, David. So there's three basic things that I think everyone has to understand before we look at China today. And one is that several hundred years ago, China was the most technologically advanced country in the world. In 1800, China had the largest economy in the world. All of that began to dissipate in the 19th century. And by the time of the Communist Revolution in 1949, China was a poor, backward country. But since then, the goal of every government in China has been to regain the status of this technological and economic power. So the question in China has been how you go about doing that, and that's the difference between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, and the others, but they have the exact same goal and will have the exact same goal until they reach that status. So that's what's driving them, national interest, if you will, just like the Russians. The second thing to remember or to understand is that up until 1980, China was a very poor place. 80% of the population lived in the countryside. Everyone, and I mean everyone, all billion of them, wore the same clothes. There were three colors. There was no personal freedom. If you lived in the city, the government decided where you worked, where you lived, who went to school, what you studied, what job you had after you got out of school. You couldn't travel. You couldn't go visit your mother in another city without the state's permission. So there was poverty and there was this enormous restriction. And what's happened in 40 years has been just, nothing short of astonishing. First of all, the Chinese have an enormous amount of personal freedom. They can go wherever they like. They can get passports. They can travel. They can get whatever job they like. They can move wherever they like. There are no restrictions on that kind of thing. Their material lives are infinitesimally better. 40 years ago, not a single Chinese owned a car. Today, General Motors sells more cars in China than in the United States. And what's remarkable about this is the speed at which it happened. And let me just give you a quick example. On the other side of the border of Hong Kong, there's a place called Shenzhen. And Shenzhen, up until the 80s, was a farming village. Didn't have a single two-story house. There were rice fields everywhere. A few thousand people lived there. Today, 40 years later, Shenzhen is a city of 20 million people. It has an international airport that's the UPS Asian hub. It has a subway system of 200 stops. It took New York City 70 years to build 3 stops on the 2nd Avenue line. They built 200 in 40 years. They have a 115-story building. They have multiple 50, 60-story buildings. It is the Silicon Valley of China. Now that's 40 years. So the speed is just incredible. And the third thing to understand is that because of the personal freedoms, because of the material well-being of the Chinese over the last 40 years, there's popular support for the Communist Party. Yes, there are dissidents. Yes, they are treated in the most abominable way. All of that is true. But the reality is that the middle class, the intellectual class, support the Communist Party. This is not the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. There is genuine support for the party. So those are the 3 basic things to understand about China. One of the things that we confuse here, ourselves about China, is that somehow an outside force is going to prevent China's continual economic, militarily, technological rise. That's not going to happen. If China is stopped in any way or hindered in any way, it'll be because of domestic issues. There are a long list of very serious domestic issues that the government is grappling with, and no guarantee that they can actually overcome some of the issues. But that's what's going to hinder their growth, not what we do on the outside. So what can we do? Well, it's important to understand that the issues that the Trump administration has listed about China, the problems we have with China, are not just the United States problems. They are the same problems that the Japanese have, that the Europeans have, Australians, Canadians, and so on. There is an agreement as to what the issues are. The disagreement is how to deal with these issues. And the Trump administration has decided that it can, on its own, solve these problems. Well, we've seen in 3.5 years, it has done absolutely nothing. The trade talk, the tariffs, which are actually a tax on Americans, not on the Chinese, all of these things have produced absolutely no change in how the Chinese run their economy or anything else. And so this unilateral diplomacy is simply not going to work. We stop selling them soybeans, they buy them from Brazil and Australia. So the solution, if there is a solution, is for all of the countries who have these problems to get together, to build a coalition of allies that will present China with a series of diplomatic negotiations to resolve some of these issues. Individually, no country is going to be able to do that, not even the United States. So, as I said, this has not, the Trump administration's actions have not changed China's habits. It hasn't really helped Americans. We've been taxed through these tariffs. Subsidies to farmers who've lost their sales is another tax on us, and hasn't hurt China in any appreciable way whatsoever. So, how's that?
All right. Well, thank you. You've given us a lot to chew over. And following up on what Tom said, last week, Secretary of State Pompeo unexpectedly announced that the U.S. was ready to join a European Union effort to push back against China that he previously seemed to ignore. But the Washington Post reported that European leaders were more about waiting for the outcome of November's election, wary of President Trump's earlier insults and distancing, shifting policies, and weak follow-through. Which brings us back to Churchill. Is it really China or the United States that's now more mysterious, difficult to understand and predict? Wave your hands with if you want to give your answer. Anybody? Wait a second, I'm looking. Anybody waving their hands? Yes, go ahead, John.
Let me just unmute myself. Good. I mean, it seems to me that under the circumstances, it's clearly the United States that's the biggest mystery. But hopefully, this mystery is going to be resolved in November and will become a somewhat more comprehensible, more understandable, more rational, more effective, more allied, interested country again. But the question, it seems to me, that's of interest is, under the circumstances, that is until November, what are the kinds of things that could be done if there were greater rationality in our government? And secondly, what about after November? Then do we adopt a policy of seeking allies and trying to work together to achieve some of these differences?
Anybody else want to respond? Well, I will. Also last week, a new study, I mean, just along the lines you started to lay out, a new study by the Council on Foreign Relations concluded that China is likely to, quote, wield greater power within long-standing organizations like the World Bank, the World Health Organizations, and the United Nations, and also will strengthen new China-dominated institutions. So the question is, do you think it's in the U.S. strategic interest to pull away from such international bodies, as the current administration has done, instead of keeping tabs on, and to some degree, whatever degree possible within the context of those groups, counter China's play for greater influence? Do we pull away from groups because China has too much influence, or do we start trying to?
The reason China has more influence is because America's pulled away. When America pulls away, a vacuum gets created. And China has quite happily stepped into these various vacuums to give themselves more power. So if one continues to believe that America has a role in the world, stepping away from these institutions is the exactly wrong thing to do. As to what can be done, not much can be done between now and January. Hello, are we still out there? Okay. Not much can be done. Symbolically, sanctioning a handful of officials is not really going to do anything in this regard. It's symbolically, Congress passes legislation which doesn't have any teeth. Sanctioning a handful of people doesn't have much teeth, but symbolically it sends a message, and I guess that's important simply of itself. But what has to happen after January, when hopefully a new administration takes over, is an alliance has to be built. Going to the World Trade Organization or multilateral diplomacy, whichever they feel is more effective. And China, if China has to face 15, 20 countries allying against them to change their habits, there's much more pressure on them to do so, as opposed to one country doing it. And the final thing America has to do to compete is to do what America does best: compete, invest in technology, invest in science, keep ahead of China by innovation, by technological advance. That's not what's happening. In fact, during the Trump administration, money has been taken out of science, out of technology, out of education. And so that has to be reversed.
Science has become a four-letter word.
That's right.
Interestingly, both China and large parts of the US now have increasing or returning peaks of COVID-19. Yet interestingly, the European Union this week extended its block on American visitors, not the same for the Chinese. Do you think that the way each country has handled the virus will have much impact on how other nations judge which has the best form of government? Capitalist democracy or the communist authoritarianism, which has done such remarkable work in the last 40 years? I'd like to see what people think about that. Is coronavirus, besides the fatal threat that it is, becoming a litmus test that the world is going to use to judge the United States and as against China? Any thoughts?
You can't most countries can't replicate what China does. You can't close down whole cities completely the way China does. You can't, governments can't trace people the way China does. It's not a replicable thing.
Hungary is making a good try.
Hungary is, but they're not as good at it.
Well, no, of course you're right that the infrastructure that China has developed before the 40 years and during the 40 years gives it that kind of power.
Sure.
But your suggestion that only problems within China will determine the fate of China's advance, let's say, along many lines. There was an interesting story in the papers in the foreign press this week about China's fear of revealing how many troops it lost on some border clashes with India, things that are like a footnote to us, but clearly, according to this account, of serious concern to the Chinese leaders. And what we forget is that this vast country that they control with the agreement of the government, as it were, but it's a huge amount. And even the People's Army, if there were really dissatisfaction, they would have a huge problem on their hands. It's not clear, or I would ask Tom, is it clear whether Beijing can control its own country if the country starts to turn against it?
So here's the deal. In the 80s, they gave up Marxism. There's no more communism except rhetorically in China. And therefore, the Communist Party doesn't really rule with an ideology. But there's a social contract. And the social contract says, we, the Communist Party, will make your life materially better every year in return for your loyalty to us as the only ruling party. That's the deal. And for 30 plus years, the Communist Party has held up its side of the bargain. And as a result, the people, as I said, I think the party has a great deal of popular support because of that. What happens when they can't do that? COVID is an exception. I don't think this is going to turn people against the party, but you can't keep increasing your economy 6, 7, 10% a year forever. They've done it for 30 plus years. They can't do it forever. At some point, there's going to be a downturn. And then what happens? Then the social contract is broken, and we honestly don't know what will happen.
The story that I read.
Sorry. I noticed that John Kranzler has had his hand up for a while. So
Sure, go ahead, John.
Yeah.
I just wanted to respond further to the question that you asked. It seems to me that the gross incompetence of the United States in handling COVID compares very unfavorably with the much greater appearance, at least, of coherence and direction that one sees in China. And it seems to me that that's something else that weakens our image and weakens our ability to exercise the kind of leadership that has traditionally been what we've done.
I can't tell whether Rosalie is raising her hand or just fixing her screen. Rosalie, you have to unmute yourself. Well,
I'm Rosalie's husband. My name is Stephen. I went to China as a businessman in the mid-'70s and witnessed Deng Xiaoping coming out of transition and saying that this is one country with two systems. And that's exactly what they are. They're communists, they're socialists, and they're industrialists, and they're entrepreneurs, and they're technologists. And the thing that they do very well is steal. The bottom line is America has to be smart enough to literally do business with them, where either they can steal by buying products from us and taking them apart, but if they're stealing our technology illegally, well, then obviously we have to literally stop that. The bottom line is that China is doing exactly what they're going to do. they're too big a country to have eyes on other countries. They have a big responsibility with dealing with 2 billion people and continuing to deliver the economic system that they have for the last 40 years. We can't distort that. That's a reality, and we have our reality. And until our country gets its act together with its ending its racism and not being this perfect democracy as we think it is, we have no right to tell another country how to deal with their problems until we fix our own.
Well, that was a question I was going to get to later, but it's interesting. How we have dealt with the virus is one litmus test for the world. How we have dealt with the inequality and racial problems in this country is another. And I wonder, to the degree, as you've just said, what other people feel that the protests here, the inequality that's been highlighted now, sort of gives China not a full pass, but when we point to the outrages they commit against the Muslim Uyghurs in their country or against Hong Kong, do people think that what's going on here gives them something to point at and say, you know, look to your own problems?
Sure.
May I add to the question to something to Tom? So you mentioned that there are a number of China has to deal with. What do you think the most important ones or the most acute ones are?
China's problem, domestic problems? Is that what you're asking?
Domestic problems.
Sure. One is an aging population. The number of children being born is very, very low. A country needs 2.1 child per mother to maintain a stable population. It's down now, China's now down to 1.4, 1.3, which means that the base of the population, the people who are going to be working to keep up the economy, to pay the pensions and health care of the elderly, is diminishing. The number of elderly is increasing. Japan has this problem too. It's much more acute in Japan than in China, but China has, this is a huge problem for it. It won't have enough people to support its elder population or enough workers. So that's a problem. The disparity of wages, much like in this country, has grown enormously. 40 years ago, everyone was poor. There was, in some ways, it was a classless society. Obviously, there wasn't 100% classless, but it was because everyone was poor and everybody knew what everyone made, and you had this kind of transparency. Now, of course, you have very wealthy. China has more billionaires than the United States, and it still has poor people. So that's a big problem. Maintaining the material growth. As I said, there's a social contract. The party said, support us as long as we keep you getting better. Your life gets better year to year. Once that doesn't happen, what happens to the support? There is enormous tension underneath the surface. In the Chinese areas, the tensions are local. Local officials who may be corrupt, local officials who are taking land and selling it to developers to make a profit for themselves. Pollution is a huge problem. But in the minority areas in Tibet and Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, right underneath the surface, there is an enormous amount of tension. And in places like Tibet and Inner Mongolia, at the moment, things are quiet, but it's not very deep down, the anger and the alienation. And it won't take much to spark some kind of revolt. So off the top of my head, those are the big ones.
Let me ask a question, Tom. I mean, China was in an earlier period known for its one child per family effort to keep the population under control. Could there not be incentives to reverse that?
There are incentives now. They're not working.
For more children.
They're not working. They're not working because the population began to decrease before the one-child policy. mostly because of urbanization. As in every other country, once people urbanize, once they begin to live in small apartments in cities, once women go to work, they have fewer children.
Is it science fiction to think that the penning in of the Uyghurs, Muslims in this country and in the Middle East are known for their higher birth rates? I mean, is there a master plan to increase a youthful population by converting the Uyghurs, re-educating the Uyghurs? No.
The Uyghurs represent less than 1% of the population. It's a tiny, tiny amount. For that to become any kind of appreciable number would take centuries.
So the answer would seem to be, as it is in this country, despite the administration's prejudices, immigration, bringing in young workers from other countries. Is that conceivable within the Chinese mentality?
Not at the moment. But Japan, which is more anti-immigrant than even China is, has now quietly begun to allow immigrants in because of the problem that I talked about, that they just don't have enough workers. And yes, at some point, that's what's going to have to happen. But they're not going to like it.
Let me go back a little. Last week, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, recently released trade data show the trade war's early impact on the world's two largest economies was paradoxically largely opposite of what the White House promised.
Yep.
Tariffs have produced no real improvement in the United States' underlying trade balance, while China's trade surplus has increased and its export markets have become more diversified.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to ask the group is, thinking about your own situation and the fact, as Tom noted, that tariffs, which Trump seems to think of as a weapon, are really paid for by American consumers. Have there been significant changes in which products from China you're buying and the prices you're paying for them, discounting, of course, increases for all products caused by the pandemic? I'd like to get a sense from people in this area what the trade war has meant to them in terms of the stuff that they buy. So please wave your hands. I can't see anybody.
Tom is
Anybody?
waving his hand.
I'm sorry, what?
I said Tom was waving his hand.
Okay, well, that'd be nice.
No, I wasn't.
Oh, I saw your hand.
Screen. No,
I was putting down my coffee cup.
Oh,
seriously, are people buying different products or finding that the products they were relying on have changed significantly?
I've seen no discernible difference.
Well, that's fascinating. And as we've said, I don't think anybody would disagree, but do you think that the sanctions are having a little, or no impact on each nation's non-economic policies and practices, domestic and international? I don't think anybody can point to any significant impact.
No, it only impacts the people directly involved. So farmers, manufacturers, but the average person, and certainly not the policies of the countries, have been affected at all.
All right, let's turn to Hong Kong. China has cracked down despite Washington's threat to eliminate many trade advantages that the city's longstanding semi-independence earned it, and to block sales of U.S. high-tech that might end up on the mainland, and to sanction Beijing officials. Beijing is also planning to ease the economic impact by providing increased investment opportunities to and from the mainland to try to help perk up or make up for any losses caused by America, the United States, ending its the special status it granted to Hong Kong. Given the importance of the U.S.-China trade, do we think it's wise to employ sanctions as pressure on behalf of democracy in Hong Kong or more human rights for Muslim Uyghurs in China? Are there other steps that Washington can take beyond the rhetoric and the symbolism that Tom mentioned? Again.
So again, U.S. stopped selling some high tech to Hong Kong, so they go to Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore and they buy it. Unilateral sanctions simply don't work. They are purely symbolic. Does it make you feel better to have that symbolic gesture? Sure. But in reality, it's really not going to do much. And the truth is, there isn't much we can do, especially alone, because our economies are so intertwined, our banking systems are so intertwined that anything we can do, China can do something in return return to us. They have leverage. This is not, we're not talking about Albania here. We are talking about a major economic power.
And if I'm not mistaken, China still holds the balance of American debt.
It holds it has the largest foreign debt. It's Americans who own actually the most debt, but of foreign countries, China has the
Our
most
debt.
Yes.
They own American debt.
Right.
Yeah.
China, Japan, I think Hong Kong own about half of America's debt. But the point is that they have leverage in all sorts of ways. And so unilaterally, nothing we do is really going to have much effect. The only way we're going to change China's habits is by a united front of the various countries who have the same issues with China as we do, and they all do.
In a contrary vein, the U.S. State Department last week released a report downgrading Hong Kong for insufficient progress against human trafficking in the last year, despite mounting chaos in the streets, although it acknowledged that the government had spent $8 million for nearly 100 new employees to deal with the issue, including 2 dedicated prosecutors and 26 police officers to investigate trafficking and exploitation of foreign domestic workers. Hong Kong authorities and at least one activist leader objected to the downgrade. And I wonder, I mean, the first thought came to my mind that this was again Trump unintentionally or intentionally placating Beijing despite the rhetoric and the resolutions passed in Congress. I wonder what people think of that. Go ahead, Tom.
I know nothing about this.
Oh.
This is news to me.
It's, you know, I mean, of all the times to come out with this downgrade, it seemed typically irrational.
Nothing surprises me anymore.
Dale has a comment.
Go ahead.
I have a question, a very simple question. Nobody's mentioned Taiwan in all of this.
I was just about to do that.
How does Taiwan fit in?
Well, in fact, there has been some movement of Hong Kong residents to Taiwan. And I'm wondering whether the United States is in a position with Hong Kong to do something like the British did. Now, of course, Hong Kong was initially a British territory that was ceded back to China. And Boris Johnson has recently said that those people who qualify for passports could get British citizenship. Should the United States do for the people of Hong Kong what it does for islands that get destroyed by hurricanes or political violence, and find some way to, in the reverse of the usual Trump reaction, invite Hong Kongers to emigrate to the United States? Is that a pipe dream, or is that something that...
As long as Stephen Miller's in the White House, it's a pipe dream.
Well, okay.
His goal is to not allow a single individual into the United States, regardless of their situation.
Past the election, if there's another administration, would that be symbolism and at least some practical assistance?
You know, given the fact that we've closed the doors to real refugees, people whose lives were in danger, like the Syrians or people in Africa or whatever, I'm not sure domestically it would look very good for us to allow in large numbers of middle-class people or upper-class people when we're not really extending our hand to people who are much more in trouble. When the British left, they designated about 1.5 million people eligible for a second-class British passport. It didn't allow them to live in Britain. It allowed them to visit for up to 6 months without a visa, but it was a second-class citizenship. It wasn't citizenship. It was really, it's not quite sure what to make of it. But it wasn't an official passport. About 350,000 people accepted that offer and have this document. And it's unclear whether Boris Johnson is talking about these 350,000 or all 1.5 million. Again, at the moment, Britain is not welcoming immigrants, quite the opposite. So I find it hard to believe that the Conservative government of Britain is going to allow tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people to come into Britain, especially given its economic problems at the moment, both with COVID and Brexit. So I'm not sure how much of this is just a gesture or how much of it is real.
All right, here's another issue. I mentioned before the border clashes with India, and there's increasing tension, economic and militarily, along their border. Is there any play for the United States, should India be willing to accept it, that would put the United States more strongly in India's camp versus China? Would that do any good, or would that also be just making ourselves feel better?
There is less than zero chance that either India or China would allow America to get involved in any way whatsoever. It's never going to happen. And there's really nothing to do. These skirmishes on the border have been going on since 1962, when there was a war. Not exactly where the current skirmishes are, but along the border itself. One of the reasons China has not publicized its losses and other things is because it's trying to downplay what went on the border. These are not serious issues between China and India. They're nationalistic issues, they're symbolic issues, but they're really not that serious. China and India have a very robust trade, which India is now trying to block. So it may have consequences that were unforeseen. But if India is willing to overlook it, it's really not a major issue between them, apart from
I have two last
the
questions.
symbolic.
We're sort of running out of time, and I really would like to hear some responses from the group. If the U.S. gets into another military engagement, not symbolic flybys or naval exercises, but actual exchanges of fire with injuries or death, do you think it will mostly be with China, Russia, Iran, or some other country? Come on now, everybody should have an opinion on that. Who's going to be our next, where's our next world war going to start?
Anil?
Am I just on mute or?
No, yes, you're on mute. Go ahead.
Now you're muted.
Now you mute.
Okay.
Joanna, can you unmute him?
Yes. Oh, wait. I think we're pressing at the same time.
Anil, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
India cannot afford to go to war because India will have their asses truly booted out of this world if they do that. We failed very badly in the 1962 skirmish, and the imbalance is much greater now. As far as the US and going to war anywhere else, there is no appetite, I believe, in this country to start another war. But if anything was to happen, I think the most likely place it would be Iran. As long as you've got the current administration in power, which gives them about 5 or 6 months, it would be Iran, because most of them, they hate Iran.
Anybody else? All right, my last question. Nobody can avoid this. If you had a child, a grandchild, or a young friend of yours ask what 2 foreign languages to study, would you say French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, Russian, Arabic? Come on, you can vote on that. We won't hold you to it.
If I was talking to Americans, I'd say the first foreign language you've got to learn is English.
Well, I'll plead guilty to that.
No, I have a real love-hate relationship with the Americanization of English. I wish you guys would call it American or give it another name, but please
I agree. I
don't
agree
stop the
completely.
English language by calling it English.
I hate to see no coward turning over in his grave.
Yes.
All right.
Maybe that's a good way to end it.
I think that no coward is always a good way to end. We'll see you again whenever spring breaks through again.
Okay. I want to just take this moment to thank both Tom and David, who have given us a wonderful session here. And I think we've all learned a lot. And it's been very generous of you and very much appreciated by all of us. Thank you both. And thank you all for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.